want to mention a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. This event is being recorded. We thank you very much for joining us on Circle. Circle allows us to build community. You will be able to see this on YouTube probably next week, but we appreciate those of you who've joined us tonight live and through Circle. Second, just a quick note that the views expressed by the panelists, the facilitators, me, and participants are their own. They do not represent those of others, including their employers, affiliates, and the Institute for Liberal Values. So with those housekeeping things out of the way, I am Elizabeth, and I'll be the moderator tonight. And we have with us tonight, we have Brandy Shupatinsky, Xander Keeg, and Matt. Oh, shoot, Matt, I just blanked. See this, you said you were nervous. Now I'm nervous. I've just blanked. Thanks. I am going to let each of them introduce themselves. They currently work in the field of social work and have various backgrounds and expertise. So just real quick, can we start with Brandy and have you just introduce yourself before we get started with the questions?
Sure. Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, my name is Brandy Shupatinsky. I am a licensed social worker, licensed in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. My experience as a social worker has been mostly working with victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault within the military community predominantly. And I am currently the Director of Education and Community Engagement with the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values.
Thank you. Xander, will you go next? Oh, you're on mute, Xander.
Sorry about that. I normally don't mute myself, so I wasn't paying attention. Hello, everybody. My name is Xander Keeg. I am a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Florida. I'm also one of the directors at the Institute for Liberal Values. My background primarily with social work is as a clinical case manager working with veterans and military members and their families, a lot with addiction and post-traumatic stress and homelessness. So that's a lot of the work that I've done. In addition, I was a family caregiver for a number of years and co-founded the LGBT Caregiver Center. And I'm now the host of the Umbrella Hour podcast on the UK Health Radio Network. And I'm really happy to be here today.
Thank you. Matt?
Hello, friends. I'm Matthew Watson. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, currently licensed in Utah, where I live. I've also practiced in 4 other states, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arizona. I currently work for Family Services, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Family Services. And my background is primarily in clinical settings, but I've also done some administrative things and some macro work in trying to promote viewpoint and political diversity in social work practice.
Okay, what we've decided to do here is ask a few questions, see how many we get to, the same question of each person, and then we'll open it up towards the end for questions from the audience, if there are any, and then we have some. We certainly have more questions than we can answer, so we may go to some of our backup questions. So the question that I would like to start with is: does the social work code of ethics distinguish between social justice and social work? Do we have a volunteer to go first? I'm going to volunteer Xander. Xander, does the social work code of ethics distinguish between social justice and social work?
Well, my understanding is that social justice is a component of our code of ethics, therefore a component of what we do in our jobs. I think the issue centers on the type of social justice, the frame of the work that we're doing within the social justice realm, right? If you think about maybe the old version of mercy versus justice, I wouldn't say it's old, but, biblical. Let's say that. Mercy versus justice. When I was working as a social worker with homeless veterans, right, some people were oriented towards, we need to make sure people are housed and fed and clothed and have access to showers and laundry facilities and bathrooms. And so that was the mercy part of doing the work of social work. The justice part of the work is the people that were trying to make policy and try to create laws and raise awareness within the community, within society, about the plight of the homeless veteran. So these things go hand in hand. Again, it depends on whether it's that liberal or classical version of social justice or the critical version of social justice. And there's no clarity on that in our code of ethics. It doesn't stipulate one or the other. It says social justice. I think that might be a reason for some of the tension or contention within our field as to how you go about doing that. How do you live out this principle of social justice as, say, a psychotherapist or a case manager or a community advocate, or somebody who is working in policy or constituent affairs with a lawmaker, right? So it depends on the place that you're working. And there's a lot of maybe wiggle room, right, for people to figure that out on their own. I don't feel like there's been anything that's come straight from the National Association of Social Workers that has helped more closely define the lens through which we should view social justice and the way we practice it.
Matt, I know you've thought a lot about this. Does the social work code of ethics distinguish between social justice and social work?
You bet. It certainly does. Social work is broader than social justice. It's important to look at and define social justice as Xander was just describing, because the term social justice has evolved over time. Social justice first appeared in the NASW Code of Ethics in 1996 as a value. Prior to that, it wasn't listed as one of the core values. There are other elements of the NASW Code of Ethics that social workers can engage in that will integrate social justice. But the core value that's been there across time is service. Also, dignity and worth of the person, the importance of human relationships. Social justice can inform much of these different values, but there's nothing in the Code of Ethics that gives primacy to any one of the core values. There are different times when those values there may be some tension that's created between different ethical principles, but there isn't anything that suggests that social justice, either a critical social justice definition or even a classical social justice definition, should be primary, should be given priority over the others.
Brandy, does the social work code of ethics distinguish between social justice and social work?
I think that the Code of Ethics does make that distinction. I agree with both Matt and Xander that it does list social justice as a component of social work, and it doesn't give it primacy over the other tenets that social workers are supposed to follow in practice. I think it's also important to note that there are people that interpret the tenets of social work and they in a way that puts them in a hierarchical fashion. And I think that could be some of the reasons we're seeing some of the actions coming out of schools of social work take place right now, where they seem to actually fall out of line with the Code of Ethics as a whole, because critical social justice is being given primacy in the hierarchy, which is problematic.
So I just want to give, so I feel like Brandy may be challenged, although she agreed with Xander and Matt. She did sort of suggest that social justice issues are sort of considered of primary importance. I just want to give either Xander or Matt to respond.
No, I would agree that in our current world, there's just a lot of interest in different elements or different definitions of social justice, and it has kind of evolved over time. And social justice makes for a good story. There are a lot of stories within our history of people overcoming injustice, people overcoming compromises to their rights, to the way that they're treated. And so naturally, I think many people are drawn to social work for a variety of reasons, and social justice can be a strong magnet for people. At the same time, there are other people drawn to the profession of social work for other purposes, for purposes of service. I think that's for many people a primary draw. There are others who are drawn to try and help us become more competent, and competence is another tenet of core value within the Code of Ethics. And so I think it's natural, as Brandy mentioned, that because of the draw and the interest around social justice issues in our current world, that it has been kind of elevated or given priority, where there's nothing in there to suggest that it should. And in some ways, if we focus only on social justice, we're missing many other parts of the Code of Ethics and social work practice. And so it's important that we include social justice, but we don't necessarily emphasize it or overemphasize it at the expense of the other values.
Before I move on to the second question, anybody else want to chime in on that one?
Well,
okay. Go ahead, Xander.
It's a both and, right? Because the Code of Ethics might not give primacy to social justice, but social workers will, right? And so that can be the difference. And they're not even necessarily a member of the NASW, and they might not have ever read the Code of Ethics, right? They're, like Matt said, some people are drawn to the field of social work through the social justice lens, through community organizing in high school or college, right? And so that's what motivates them to go into the field of social justice. But, we're charged with working with the marginalized and the impoverished. And when you work with people and those having those experiences, you can't help but want to create justice for them, right, in society. It's how we go about doing it. That's, I think, what is at issue here.
Okay, so I'm going to go, I apologize to the panelists. I'm going to go a little bit out of order here because you brought this up. So one of the NASW values is social justice, as you pointed out, and social workers are charged with pursuing social change and promoting knowledge about oppression. So can you reconcile that charge, that social value, and promoting knowledge of oppression with the requirement to focus on client capacity for change, addressing their own needs, and the value labeled dignity, the worth of a person, that requires social workers to respect the inherent dignity of a person and to promote a client's socially responsible self-determination. So you all mentioned that last part, the pursuit of dignity, and I'm just how can you reconcile that with the value to pursue social change and promote knowledge about oppression?
Well, I think it's important that we acknowledge that oppression does exist, and we need to address issues that involve oppression. At the same time, there are groups of people or individuals who are not interested in an oppressive narrative. And the oppression paradigm does not align with their interests, with their values. Even though as a social worker, I may recognize dynamics in their environment, in their culture, or their situation that to me may seem oppressive or may compromise their well-being, if they're not interested in addressing those particular issues, I have to be careful not to impose my paradigm, an oppressor or oppressed paradigm on somebody who's not interested in seeing themselves as oppressed. If they're interested in personal growth, or if they have different goals, if there are different communities, different individuals, families that want to pursue their goals through a different lens, I have to be respectful of their culture, of their interests, and be very cautious about talking to them about variables that they can't control, variables that may not be within their influence, and that don't oftentimes do a lot of good to discuss in our interventions. It's important to recognize what is influenceable, what can be influenced and what can't, and oftentimes to invest in the client's interest, the person that we're trying to serve, what their interest is, rather than introducing an oppressed paradigm into the work that we do with them.
Brandy, can I get you to respond on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really about balance, and one way that work can get out of balance with looking at the value of raising awareness about oppression is if that's, like Matt said, if that's not the direction a client or a community member, somebody that social worker's helping, working with, wants to go, then it's not for that social worker to impose himself on that client. And that goes back to agency of somebody that we're working with, of a client, and also paying attention to who the work is being done with and for. And so one of the concerns I have about this particular value is it can encourage people that are in this field to make the work that they're doing about themselves and what they see or label as oppression versus the communities in which they're serving. And I think that that's a balance that professional social workers have to walk carefully and be really aware of that possibility.
So Xander, can you reconcile this sort of promotion of knowledge about oppressed and oppressor groups and this dignity value?
Sure. I mean, one of the differences between social work and some of the other, for example, mental health professional occupations is that if you go to school to be a psychologist, you might teach or you might do research, you might be a psychotherapist or a psychologist, mental health counselors, right? When you become a social worker, when you get a master's of social work, there's so many things you could do. So it's a really diversified occupation. You might be working in a medical hospital, a psychiatric hospital, a K through 12 school, in a jail, out in the community, your own private practice, in a group practice. So it's very diversified, similar to nursing, I think. That's usually how I make people understand how diversified we are. I had the pleasure and the privilege of, in my Master's of Social Work program, taking 3 community organizing courses that were taught by Professor Michael Eichler. And Professor Michael Eichler is the developer of the concept of consensus organizing. And the Consensus Organizing Institute is at my alma mater, San Diego State. And he came to this idea of consensus-based organizing in the community. And we're talking the communities where people are struggling. There are food deserts, right? There might be a lot of homelessness, crime, lack of good lighting and public transportation, right? Lots of different issues that our people are working with. And his background was working in those kinds of communities. But before he created the consensus based organizing model, he was a protege of Saul Alinsky, who is the person who popularized the conflict-based model of community organizing, and most famously is known for his book, Rules for Radicals, right? And so this idea is going into these neighborhoods that are struggling, whether it's working class struggle or it's poverty-based struggle. He would go into these neighborhoods with this conflict-based organizing model, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't work. He wanted to know why it didn't work all the time, right? It was being purported as the most successful way to remind people, you have too much. You need to give some of what you've got to other people. And they have a right to be angry at you and demand it and take it from you, really, if that's what it comes down to. And consensus-based organizing is like, okay, wait a minute. Let's get all the players together in the community, and let's bring together the community-based organizations that are working in those communities. Let's bring everybody together, including maybe the banks and the real estate brokers and agents and the school teachers and administrators. Let's get everybody who has an investment in that community together to come up with the solutions for the community, rather than, doing vandalism or protest, right? It's a very different way of looking at the worth and dignity of the individual. Do you tear it all down in a fight for their justice, or do you find a way to work with the community to bring about the justice that will serve them for the long term, not just in the short term? Conflict-based organizing is very short-term driven. It doesn't have good lasting impact on a community. Consensus-based organizing has longer impact on a community and on the people in that community. So I think it's the same principle that's driving those two very different models of how to make life better for people in certain neighborhoods or certain countries or certain states.
So Xander kind of planted the seed for the next question. So one of the stated purposes of the NASW code is for the general public to hold the field of social work accountable. So if you were, how and for what do you recommend that the general public holds the field accountable? So I'm thinking of students and clients, as well as, people living in the community who may or may not even be aware of how they're benefiting from social work. So for the general public to hold the field accountable, what would you suggest that that people like students, your clients, and the general public be concerned with regard to social work, question the field of social work about demand of the field?
Well, I think one of the things that that is important about social work is that we recognize that we are really social workers first, and political means is one means to the end of creating peaceful pluralism, helping different cultures, helping a pluralistic culture, helping us work well together. I think that it's important that we're accountable to recognize and to invest in diversity, and not just ethnic or racial or different type, commonly sexual orientation, gender, all those kinds of things that we see as important parts of diversity. But we also recognize that perhaps the most important is that each of these different types of diversity, there are different viewpoints, different perspectives, different values within each of those groups or those populations. And so acknowledging and recognizing that different viewpoints need to be looked at and addressed and taught within social work institutions. There are some, one way is if only one perspective or ideology is taught in an institution, it can create some concerns by others who may not hold to that particular ideology. An example of this is in the state of Idaho, where some legislators were concerned about one particular ideology being taught, and it resulted in a loss of funding to some of the universities there. And this is just one situation where if there's viewpoint or political or ideological domination, that when somebody else comes into power, the pendulum swings and we lose our credibility, and sometimes can lose public support, funding, and so forth. So I think accountability, if anything, it can hold us accountable to help us be competent in being social workers first, giving primacy to that, and recognizing that political work is simply part of some of the things that we might do to promote the welfare and the good of the world. But be careful not to take an ideological dominant approach. Recognize that anything that we teach or emphasize or do needs to take into consideration the importance of peaceful pluralism and learning to work well together.
Brandy, how do you think that the community, students, clients, general public should or could be holding social work accountable?
I think really by considering one main question: is it accessible to all? So, as Matt just said, social workers, the work that we do should be accessible to everyone. There isn't a litmus test that a client has to meet before we should be assisting them, which Xander mentioned a few minutes ago, just how diverse the profession is. That's why you have social workers who work with both victims and perpetrators of crimes, because there isn't a litmus test. The job of a social worker is actually to try to make things better in overall society, which means that there can't be, okay, we'll work with these people because they voted how I do. But those ones who don't, no, I won't help them. And really thinking about, imagine what it would look like if that is how we operated. If the food pantry, if the substance abuse clinic only took people, only fed people, only helped those who agreed with the staff that worked there, with the social workers that work there. It is really looking at the question, does this profession serve everybody? So I used to work with victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. If a client came in for help, if she or he didn't vote like I did, or maybe they didn't meet a certain requirement, maybe they came from a very affluent socioeconomic background, do I have to consider, no, I'm not going to help them because they make too much money? They voted a different way than I did. That's I think a centerpiece to this profession, is that our work is supposed to be accessible to all.
Brandy, that's a really good point. I think it's important that we highlight that in the definition of social justice within the NASW Code of Ethics, it does emphasize equality of opportunity, not necessarily equality of outcome. And I really like what you said. So thank you for emphasizing that availability to all.
Xander, do you have anything to add to what do you think that the general public, students, clients should be holding social work accountable for?
Well, I think there's many layers of accountability holding, or at least many avenues. And so, for example, all schools of social work in the United States must be accredited. And so there's specific curriculum that is put forward. Schools can't just make up their own curriculum, and they need to go through the accreditation process. We all must, for certain jobs, we all must pass a very extensive, comprehensive examination, sometimes before we graduate our program, sometimes before we receive our licensure. So people who are going into licensed social work, licensed clinical social work. And we also have licensing boards at every state level, right? So the licensing boards are consumer advocacy organizations. If you are working with a customer, a client, a patient, a consumer, right? Different terms that people use, and you've done something that violates the code of ethics, or a law in the state where you are practicing, you can then report the social worker to the licensing board. We also must complete field education while we're in school, a certain amount of time and a certain number of hours we must complete in order to demonstrate that we know what we're doing. We're not just learning things in books, that we're actually working out in the field. I know for myself, I was, as a first year graduate student, I was doing 20 hours a week. As a second year, 25 hours a week, and I was under clinical supervision during that. And then we have a 2 to 4 year internship process after we graduate, where we're under clinical supervision to collect, in most states, around 3,000 hours, right? So there's all of these sort of fail-safe levels of accountability that are put in. We also have mandates for continuing education for renewal of our licenses. So there are all of these things that exist. Now, one of the things that I love doing as a social worker is not just advocacy work. Brandy mentioned agency, is educating clients on their own ability to advocate for themselves. And so to be able to determine, am I being served or am I not? And is it an ethical violation? Is it a crime against, is it a law that's being broken? Or is it just a mismatch between the intervention model that's being used or the particular orientation that we use and the way that we're practicing? Sometimes we don't match with every single client out there. That doesn't mean that we're behaving unethically. It just might mean that we're not synced up. Somebody might want a more narrative style of therapy, and you're a dynamic, therapist. That's really important to be able to make sure that clients and patients not only have the ability to access us, but that they can also learn what type of social work we do. What's the lens through which we are working? Theoretical orientation. I'll just mention that, like the ability for our clients and patients to know what that is, so that they understand why we're talking the way we're talking and why we're inviting them to look at their situation in the way that we're asking them. And it might be a mismatch. So we have to be able to be careful between when we're doing harm to our clients and when we're just practicing in a way that just doesn't work for them. But when we're causing true harm, they have the ability to go and make those complaints, and they will be investigated. And if it rises to the level of the licensing board feeling like we've actually done something, they will notify us, and we'll have to go through a process with them to see if we're truly in violation of the code of ethics. So there's a lot built in. Within the code of ethics, it says that we don't discriminate based on socioeconomic status, sex, gender identity, religion, and political affiliation, not to our clients and not to our colleagues. And so we might get a little bit into this as we continue talking, but that's how Matt and I met, was through discussions on a NASW communication board, where there were people following the Donald Trump election who were under the opinion that if you were a conservative or Republican or you voted for Donald Trump, that you were in automatic violation of the code of ethics of the NASW. And it's like, people were saying, if a client came in to see me and they're wearing a MAGA hat, I would turn them away. It's like, no, we're not allowed to do that. We need to see that client, and then we need to talk to our supervisor. We need to have a consultation with another clinician and work through those feelings on our own. That's on us, not on the client.
So Brandy, I see you nodding. I just want to make sure you don't want to add something.
No, I do. It's just a small point, but I think that the code of ethics, the values of the social work profession, are set there to remind social workers many different things. But one of them is that we're not central to when we're working with a client or a community. They are. So I just agree with what Xander said. It's for social workers to take it upon ourselves to work through any feelings that we have about working with a specific client or with a certain community, not to put that burden on the client or the community.
So Matt, I can't actually see you in this view, so I just want to make sure you don't have anything to add.
No, I just agree with what both Randy and Xander have said, and just recognize that competence is one of the the 6 values as well. And so one of the questions that we might ask ourselves is, what evidence is there that we are competent, that our practice is competent, that we are strengthening communities, families, and individuals? Is evidence-based practice part of the work that we do? And I think that's one way that we can that we can be held accountable, is the degree to which we're demonstrating that we're making a difference. I think one of the things that might be of interest is if we were to compare, say, classical and critical social justice and the impact that has on accountability. There are different ways that can happen. I think the critical theory lens, my understanding, I could be wrong on this, is that there's an interest in self-reflection. There's an interest in empathy. There's an interest, an invitation for us to understand the impact that our policies or the things, our history, the impact that has had on other people, specifically the marginalized and the oppressed. And so that cultural humility, that desire for empathy, I think to some degree that's rooted in a desire for accountability to these different constituencies. I think where it goes from there and the approaches that is taken, I think that's where we have to ask, is it effective? And can we be culturally humble? Can we be reflective? Can we be empathic and understand the impact that some of the policies in our history have had on oppressed groups? Is that making a difference? And is that really helping them become the people that they want to be and the communities that they want to be? Or is it creating more division by emphasizing different group identities rather than an overall human identity, if you will? And so there's, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, is there a place then that, because I think that, I mean, you've all said little bits of that. Is there a place for students, for clients, for, you know, the community at large to ask those questions of the field more generally, of you know, of social workers, but also just of the field?
I think I understand the question.
Go ahead, Xander. Sorry.
No, I was saying I don't understand the question.
Well, the question, I mean, so Matt was suggesting that, you know, that you all ask yourself, not you personally, but you personally and the field in general, ask themselves that really hard question. Is you know, is something like, you know, oppressor, oppressed viewpoint really, is that the best for the client? And are we doing our best work through that lens? And I guess I was, you know, just trying to sort of circle back around. What could students do, like, for example, who are in graduate school, to sort of spur that question? What could clients do? What could, you know, the general public who might be benefiting either directly or indirectly from, you know, the field?
Well, I think I've heard from enough students now over the last few years that they don't feel like they can say anything that's contrary to maybe what the professor is saying or what other students are saying or what they're reading in their, maybe not in their texts, but in the supplemental reading that they might be doing. That there's a way in which they either feel silenced or they're selecting to be silent for reputation protection in order to just get through the process. I think, you know, I haven't worked very much in psychotherapy as a clinical social worker. I was mostly in clinical case management with very high acuity clients, so people that had a lot of really complex needs. And one of the things that wouldn't work for most of those clients is to keep them mired in all the ways in which they're being held back, all the ways in which people are fighting against them, right? It's like, I couldn't solve homelessness, either could my client, but I could get them housed, right? We couldn't solve unemployment, but we could find them work, right? So if I spent all of my time working with my clients on how really terrible things are historically and how that's impacted them today and how it interferes with their ability to get ahead, although they might be feeling all of those things, right? It's not good for clients or patients to be stuck in those places. It creates a lot of anger and a lot of anxiety. For some people, it could make their depression worse or bring it on, right? So it's acknowledging that, yes, there is an injustice, and there's staying focused on what are your goals? What can you accomplish? What do you need help with? I don't really like the idea of working with the person and just constantly keeping them in that focus. I mean, that to me is like something they can do on their own at a consciousness raising, discussion group with their peers. It's not something I should be doing with them as a clinician, in my opinion.
There is some interesting research on this topic. There's an article by Ashley Davis and Rebecca Myrick, or a study where they looked into what they were researching microaggressions among social work undergraduate students. And what they found, to their surprise, was just what Xander was describing. Was among their findings was a common microaggression were from the traditionally religious and conservative students who felt that only liberal viewpoints were welcome in their classroom. And it was interesting. They really found that kind of an interesting and unexpected outcome, that there were only certain views, only certain perspectives that were allowed to be voiced. So there was some of the students, I believe, mentioned that they were very careful about what they discussed, that they may have felt scolded for having certain beliefs or certain perspectives. So that's just one arena. And Xander and I have actually worked with a student who approached us because as he posted on that board that we had mentioned, he was censored. He was shut down, and people were threatening to and they contacted the school where he attended because of his viewpoints that he was communicating. So again, the accountability factor is just inviting people to speak up, inviting people to acknowledge and to recognize that there are different ways to approach things, and even different ways to interpret social justice. But silencing people is not the way to go about practicing social work. So I think inviting people to speak up and to talk about their perspectives is critical.
Well, we're trained to do advocacy to a certain degree and to assist our clients in self-advocacy, and yet the reality is that we get stymied in our own advocacy, right, for ourself, for our profession, and because the risk is so high. And I know that personally because I was a member of the NASW National Committee for LGBT Issues for 8 years, and I was the chair of that committee for 2 years. And the work that I was doing, primarily with transgender veterans and military service members, got me some attention back in the day, and I was honored as the California Social Worker of the Year in 2018, and then the National NASW Social Worker of the Year in 2020. And then all of a sudden, that brought me to the attention of people who decided they didn't like the things that I was saying and tried to get me stripped of those titles. I was invited to speak at NASW conferences, and one in particular revoked that invitation because two individuals had contacted their chapter to barrage them with complaints about how, I think they said I was a transphobic person. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm a trans man. I completely reject the idea that I'm a transphobic person. I also did an event once with a former NASW president, who is Mitt Joyner, who is no longer with us. Really wonderful woman, and she was leading these chats that were live on Facebook, and we were talking about LGBT issues, like what is the L, the G, the B, what do those letters mean? And it was just two social workers in addition to Mitt, and I said something about how I was not in favor of using the pronoun it or itself, or like I thought that was dehumanizing, and that I was going to use a person's first name or their nickname or something like that, other than referring to an individual. A human being is it and itself. And another NASW chapter thought that was so offensive that I had some social worker from the state contacted them to say that I had caused them harm because I had said that. And so the executive director of that NASW state chapter sent out a public statement to their entire membership base that I was committing violence towards the trans community for my language. Suffice it to say that big NASW shut them down rather quickly. They're not allowed to issue statements like that without the national office approving it. My name was stricken from it, but it was attached to a link that had the Facebook Live recording on it, so anybody could go and watch it. And so there are these efforts to silence students and silence professors and silence professionals out in the field. In any way possible. People refer to it as cancel culture, right, or deplatforming. And so I've had that experience firsthand, and it's no fun. It's no fun to be the target of that kind of vitriol from my members of my own profession.
Well, and among the standards for social workers in the National Association of Social Workers is to defend against colleagues who, defend and assist colleagues who are unjustly charged with unethical conduct. And so that was one of the things that we had thought to talk about. So do you see evidence that social workers are taking that aspect of the ethics code seriously?
I mean, I think that Xander's unfortunate, horrible experience demonstrates no. But part of that also goes to how these things are defined. So what's happening now is the social is being taken out of social worker, and the field that is supposed to be so broad and accessible to all is shrinking and becoming more narrow ideologically. And as that happens, I think that it's unfortunate, but if that continues to happen, I should say, we're going to see social work as a field, as a discipline, and as a profession become less and less positively impactful.
Well said, Brandy. Well said.
Before we, as we close in on the hour, we still have 15 or 20 minutes, but I wanted to make sure that we got to this question for everyone to answer. What is your vision for the future of the social work practice, for social work education, and for social work ethics? So that's three visions of the future. And Brandy, I'm going to start with you only because you already mentioned, the education piece. And so, say more as you wish. But also if you have something to say about you said something about the practice piece, about education and the future of social work ethics.
I mean, I hope that social work remains committed and true to the profession as it started, as far as being broad, accessible to all. And that, of course, goes back to the roots of where social workers gain their knowledge, which is, of course, in university programs, but also in field placement. So I hope that ideological or political capture of schools of social work or higher education don't continue in such a way that they make the field narrow and inaccessible to the people that we serve. Because we've talked about it for this entire time, both Xander and Matt have discussed it, how broad the field is, how broad the discipline is, but it's not so broad that there aren't standards, that competence isn't something that's highly valued and that's necessary to practice social work. And I go back to the idea that social work as a profession is supposed to be accessible to everybody, regardless of their political, religious, ideological stances on things. And people are not supposed to be shunned because they hold a different viewpoint or because they hold a certain spiritual practice. That's the point of the field, is to be able to work with everybody everywhere, which is something that social work has historically done.
Matt, how do you feel about the future of social work practice, education, and the future of social work ethics?
I see a future of peaceful pluralism, where viewpoint diversity is the hallmark of social work. That we don't define people by their group, we define people by their divine identity that connects all of us. We don't define people in a way that divides. We define us in ways that unite us and draw us together socially, across political differences, across religious differences, across viewpoint differences, across racial, ethnic, and anything that might that has divided us. I hope that through good social work we can ultimately coexist in a pluralistic society. I see a future in social work where our civil liberties are intact, where we are not insulated from other ideas, other perspectives, but we are refined by those other ideas and other perspectives. I see the future of social work where dialogue is the way that we address differences rather than activism or a personal agenda. Those are some things that I would look for in the future, is essentially dialogue-based, peaceful pluralism, finding common ground, working across differences, being refined by our differences, improved by our differences, rather than some of the things that we've seen recently with ideological domination.
How about you, Xander? What do you see? What is your vision for the future of social work practice, education, and ethics?
Well, I'm in agreement with both Brandy's ideas and Matthew's. The only thing I think I'd like to add is when it comes to education, right? I said the schools of social work need to be accredited, and it's the Council on Social Work Education that does that. And my understanding is that there might be a way in which some of the curriculum that is coming out and is being put into our schools of social work, the ways in which people are being taught, right? Again, using more of the critical versus the classical or liberal social justice lens in particular, is more indoctrination than education. So I really hope that we stay true to education, which is just like the classes we take in all of the different theoretical orientations or intervention models that we learn on, how we want to work with clients based on different populations and in different settings with different backgrounds, right? So we're not told you must have this particular theoretical orientation and you must adhere to this specific intervention model, right? We have the ability to learn about the various options and make those choices for ourselves. So it's not an indoctrination process in that way, but some of the courses, which may end up being mostly electives, where there is a community organizing or a social justice lens, from what I can tell from talking to some students, they feel as if it's much more like an indoctrination. They're only being given the critical lens with which to view the issues that they're working on at that local level. Maybe even field education sites might be doing that. If you're working in a particular community, let's say homelessness, and your job is to work at a church or a social service agency, and the way in which the lens that they're using to determine why people are experiencing what they're experiencing and how the social worker or the social work student should view them and their situation, and therefore how to work with them, right? Instead of giving them the option. It's like if some social workers want to take a more critical social justice lens to the work that they do, that's fine. But to make us all do that, that's what I worry about, the possibility of our education going in that direction.
I would agree with Sander and just highlight that part of social work is being pro-social, pro-human. That's something that, you know, that there are different organizations and entities out there that address these types of things, including the Institute for Liberal Values. But, you know, there are other organizations that are trying to promote these things. The Heterodox Academy comes to mind. The Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, Braver Angels. There are a number of entities and organizations that are helping us to really be a pro-social world where we're trying to bridge differences.
Brandy, I just want to give you a chance. Do you have anything to add to that? Let's circle back around.
No, I think well said.
One question that that Matt had sent me, since we have a couple of minutes left. So Matt had wondered, how can a social worker advocate for a position that potentially differs from an official position taken by the NASW? How can a social worker ethically advocate for a position that differs from an official position taken by NASW? So Matt, I'm gonna throw that to you, since that was a question that you hoped that maybe we might get to.
I was hoping somebody else would answer that. NASW as an organization is not a monolith. While they do have a group of people who are their policy chairs and make recommendations, this isn't an organization, at least I don't think it is. I haven't been kicked out yet. When they're advocating for things that where I may have a different perspective, or where, you know, for example, I think we need to have a better conversation around voting rights. And, you know, is it really unreasonable to expect somebody to have an ID, to produce a form of identification that's so easily available to vote? And are we really restricting voting rights? Or how else would you propose that we legitimize the validity of a voter? How else are we going to prevent fraud and corruption from happening? These are all just a few examples. There are many who feel like we should not have exams, licensing exams. And okay, if that's the position that you want to take, how else will you demonstrate competence and demonstrate your ability to practice effectively as a social worker? What other ways are there? So I just recognize that different chapters and the national organization itself pursues different things where I might have some different perspectives, and not necessarily, I'm not interested in deconstruction and taking apart things that have been part of our democracy. But are there ways that we can come together and not necessarily take a political approach when there might be a more effective way to bring about some changes? So how is that ethical? Well, political diversity is in the code of ethics. And so diversity includes you. If you have a position that's different than the majority of those who ever decided to push a particular agenda, then let it be. But in order for the social work tent to expand, as Brandy was just mentioning, we have to recognize that, this isn't an organization that is kicking too many people out for views that they may consider outside the lines or apostate, if you will.
Randy or Xander, do either one of you want to take on this really big question? How can a social worker ethically advocate for a position that differs from an official one?
I'll just add quickly that I hope that they do it quickly, because while political and viewpoint diversity are still part of social work ethics, there is a real possibility that changes, especially if the education that newer social workers are getting is leading them down the road to think that having a more strict, rigid orthodoxy in thinking is the direction the profession goes, then I worry that may trickle up to things like the NASW. And if that happens, I think that there are a couple of different courses of action that can happen at the level of the NASW. One can be that the organization itself ceases to be relevant. Perhaps an alternative association comes up, but what does that do to the field? I think it has the potential to degrade it. So I just hope that people take not really advantage, but acknowledge that there is a privilege to having an association that allows and celebrates and welcomes viewpoint diversity. And in order to keep it, we need to engage it.
Do you want to add anything, Xander?
Yeah, I think that the field of social work is not unusual in what I'm about to say, which is, I think it's a small fraction, right, of very outspoken individuals who take that more rigid or critical point of view and apply it and then want to extend it out to everybody else. And I'm hopeful that we've hit a tipping point where more and more people are starting to realize that there's no need to stay quiet, that they can not necessarily challenge those individuals, but just speak their own mind. And one of the things I love about being licensed as a licensed clinical social worker at that very highest level, I am afforded the recognition of I am licensed to practice at the individual level, or the independent level, I should say, right? And I like that. It's a higher level of recognition by the state that says you have done all that you need to do to demonstrate to us that you can work independently. And therefore, that gives me the freedom then to act in that independent way. And it doesn't violate the code of ethics, because there's ways in which it's sort of like social justice. There's ways to, you can use the code of ethics to support both sides. And then it has to come down to, people trying to figure out, like, what is the more appropriate application, or what application is the right one for that particular circumstance or this particular time and place. Because it's, and that happens with a lot of things. It's, we wouldn't need lawyers if the law was that concrete, right? But they do. It's like the spirit of the law and the word of the law, and they go back and forth fighting. And so ethics are similar, right? That what does it mean that we don't discriminate against our colleagues or clients based on, their political affiliation? Like, how are people going to apply that? And again, there are people who are social workers who aren't NASW members, have probably never read the Code of Ethics, but we're all required to take a course in ethics in order to graduate. But maybe the emphasis is heavier on the state than the the official association code of ethics, because we also have laws and ethics at the state level. So it's I'm hopeful, because I feel like we have reached that tipping point. There's always going to be the rebel rousers. And especially in social work, there's actually a lot of good that has come out of that over the years. We don't want to stamp it out completely. I don't. That's not my goal, at least. I think there's good energy and good motivation for the most part. I think we're just looking at a small group of people that are just sort of hell bent on. Well, Matt used the word deconstruct. I would say, destroy destroy certain parts of our society or individuals' lives. But again, it's not the majority. It's not even close to that. So I'm hopeful in that way.
I do have a couple of questions that we didn't talk about because they came from social work students. So one of the and this is related to one of the things that you've discussed, is that clinical social workers are expected to practice therapy, but the program that these students are in, they say, is not really having them practice it. This one student says, I've been getting by, but many of my cohort has complained about the lack of application and skills training. And then related to something else that you mentioned, social work's lack of testing. It seems that we just write papers. It's a deposit dump. There isn't a push to have things memorized, be able to recall things. They're trying to remove the LCSW exam because maybe statistically the test doesn't fare well for different populations. So if they're going to keep the practicing, so you'd have to be practicing for 2 years. So how are they going to manage this? This is, a student asking, and obviously stressed, right? Because they feel like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get my hours in. I'm not sure I'm getting the right training. And then, and yet I'm reading these 2 books, the student says, on critical race theory, and not enough science in the books. So social work is great at identifying issues, not great at finding solutions. So I'm just wondering, if any of you have some thoughts on that that's related to some of the issues that you brought up.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that when I was in my MSW program, I remember people saying, and I think I felt this way to a certain degree, I don't feel like I'm ready to go out and be a social worker. But that's not unusual. Most MSW programs are 2 years. Sometimes people do an extended one, it's 3 years. And so there's so much you have to learn. So much you have to learn. And you're doing an internship, but each of those years that you're in your studies, but the ability to just go right out of graduate school and be a high-performing clinical social worker, well, no. But I don't think we should expect that. People go through 3 years of law school. Law school doesn't prepare you to be a litigator, right? Law school teaches you how to read law and discuss law and maybe teach law. You have to get out of law school and you need to get more experience, right? Direct experience litigating. And so I think it's the same way. Medical school, you don't just graduate med school and all of a sudden you're just a big doctor who knows how to do everything. You have to go through a residency and you have to go through, there's a lot of levels. And so I think we should, I like to let social work students know, or people I know who are thinking of going into the social work profession, like, don't expect that you're going to graduate and know exactly how to be a social worker. The other thing is that some of the programs, I don't think prepare students for taking the LCSW exam. My program, we had midterms and finals in every class. We had an exam to go from the first year to the second year, and we had a big exam. These were like 4-hour exams to graduate. I feel like I was prepared to take the exam at the national level. Whereas some of my colleagues that I've met who went to school, they didn't take any tests at all. They didn't even have quizzes. They wrote papers, they did group projects, they did research assignments. They didn't take any tests at all. And I wish that, right, that's not part of the accrediting process. They don't have to all have tests. There's that, flexibility in the programs that way. But I think the people that probably struggle the most with tests are the ones that aren't being given tests along the way in their academic pursuits.
I'll say so quickly. I don't have my clinical license. I have my master's level license. I didn't pursue my clinical level license because I didn't want to practice as a clinician. I wanted to do more macro and meso level social work, which I have for the most part. However, my course of study during my MSW program was very rigorous. And again, some of it was choice, some of it was which electives I chose, but I made sure to take those courses in case I changed my mind, and actually wanted to at any point go on to pursue my clinical level license. And those courses were very specific on working with people struggling with substance abuse, with other types of mental health disorders, and looking at actual function of the brain. So it really does depend on the program. It can depend on the university and what types of concentrations they offer. But I think that what's key here is not thinking that because students aren't being prepared in their programs to pass the clinical license exam, doesn't mean you need to get rid of the exam. It means we need to better prepare future clinicians. Getting rid of we're working with people who are in many instances dealing with life and death situations. We need the most competent people possible doing that work. It's a huge responsibility. If students aren't passing the clinical licensure exam at the rate that we would hope, that doesn't mean we need to lower the standard for the exam. It really does mean we need to raise the level of education the students are receiving in their programming and afterwards, because like Xander said, you don't finish your 2 or 3 year MSW program prepared to go out and work with the most acute cases of substance abuse or mental health disorders. You do those following on hours, working with a professional who's been in the field for years, who has that experience to mentor and to teach. The learning continues after graduation.
That's a really interesting thing. This kind of raises some issues that came up earlier about how does the public hold us accountable as social workers? And Brandy, I was just having this thought, and then you just mentioned that, you primarily do macro social work. I'm not aware of a macro social work credential. Are you aware of one, or does that exist in any states that you're aware of, or any?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, again, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'm sure there are other certifications that one could get doing that, but I don't know if there's.
I've never heard of it, and so if it's not regulated, or if there aren't standards for macro social work, what are these? I think it would be important to go in and help students be good consumers of their education program and ask, what is it that you want to do? What is your career path? And does it align with whatever organization? Will this organization help you achieve your goals and your interests? Not just, provide you with a degree. Does it prepare you to practice in some way? And how do we know that? And is there a credential? Because maybe that's why, a lot of people seek the LCSW is because at least it's a credential.
Right. And that I think it comes to play looking at program. My university, I got my MSW from USC, the University of Southern California, and we had different concentrations. And in those concentrations, it's built-in standards. You had to take specific course of study that your concentration, that it would support you earning the degree in that concentration. I know it's not that way at every university. And again, that's only a university level kind of standard. It's not a state level or national standard.
Interesting.
I think it's called the Association of Social Work Boards, which administers the licensing exams. And there are bachelor level and master level examinations. And at the master's level, there's the clinical and the generalist. And so some states require even those with a bachelor of social work to be licensed or certified within the state. And so for people, for example, if you're going to be a community organizer, or you're going to be a discharge planner, or you're going to be a case manager, you might not need the clinical license, but in some states you have to get something. They want you to demonstrate competency even though you're not going to be a psychotherapist or working in a job that requires the clinical license. So you can take this generalist test. And so it's testing for very different components of the work that you're going to be doing. So because I've been licensed in several different states, and I was looking at all the different, types of licenses that they offer and what the requirements are. And that's when I learned that in some states, even the bachelors of social work people have to have a credential for the state in order to do anything that they're doing and call themselves a social worker.
I'd be interested, Elizabeth, in your students. This would be a good dialogue. What drew them to social work, and what were they hoping in terms of the outcome? And is the program delivering that?
Yeah, I was thinking as we were, sort of wrapping this up, I'm kind of like waiting to make sure that there's no other questions, because I certainly have other questions that, we might want to do a follow-up, with students who are currently in programs. We don't have to, we don't have to trash a program, but, concerns, that they have about, the education they're getting and whether they're ready. And I think that they'll be happy to hear, what you said, Matt, and well, all three of you, or Xander, like, you don't just graduate and hit the ground running. It's okay to feel insecure right now. And that doesn't mean that that there's not more or better or whatever education to be had, and that they shouldn't ask for it, right? Right. But that they also shouldn't feel that they're, that they're in trouble, I guess. Right. So Brandy, I just want to make sure before I ask another question. Again, I'm not seeing any more questions from the people who are here, but I did have another one. But I want to make sure to honor if you need to leave.
I do. I have to go. I have another thing I need to get to, but I want to say thank you, Elizabeth. It's great being here talking with you, Xander and Matt, and hope to do it again soon.
You bet.
Thanks, Brandy.
Thanks, Brandy.
Well, thanks. Thank you all for being here for this panel. I think we just got the conversation started, like I said, and thank you, Brandy Shupatinsky, Xander Keg, and Matt Watson. Thank you all for coming here and for joining Circle.